Now, the Foreign Office has summoned Sudan's ambassador, and the African Union has suspended their membership after a violent crackdown on pro-democracy demonstrators. Opposition activists say at least 100 people have been killed this week, blaming the paramilitary group formerly known as the Janjaweed. The military says the death toll is lower and has refused to hand power to civilians. A warning, this report from our international editor Lindsay Hilsum does contain some distressing images.
A few protesters braved the streets of Khartoum today. They risk being shot, as dozens were on Monday when the ruling Transitional Military Council ordered that the protest camp be destroyed. People stood on the banks of the Nile, fishing out the bodies of those who had been killed and thrown into the water, some weighted down by breeze blocks. The US and British governments have criticised the Sudanese military for their cruel tactics. But is anyone listening?
We are absolutely sickened by the reports, very credible reports, of the violence against peaceful protesters in Sudan. I've just summoned the Sudanese ambassador here to the Foreign Office to tell him that he must inform the Transitional Military Council that the UK government deplores what has happened, and we urge them to return to dialogue with the peaceful protesters.
Cast your mind back to the burnt villages of Darfur. The UN says some 300,000 Darfuris were killed by the Sudanese government as it crushed rebel groups in the region. In the vanguard, a marauding paramilitary force, often on horseback, known as the Janjaweed. Today they have armoured vehicles supplied by the United Arab Emirates. They're now called the Rapid Support Force, and they led the attack on the protest camp. Their leader, known as Hemeti, is number 2 in the military council and was recently in Saudi Arabia getting support from Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, not a man renowned for his respect for human rights. The head of the military council, Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, went to the UAE. The Gulf monarchies have promised the council $3 billion in aid. Maybe Egypt is the model, the joyful uprising that overthrew the old order, the violent destruction of a protest camp, the elevation of a military leader who then sheds his uniform. General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, now in civis, who lo and behold met Sudan's military council head 10 days ago and presumably gave him advice on how to ensure the revolution is repressed. The Sudanese military gathered for Eid prayers yesterday. History moves fast these days. They've cracked down less than 6 months after the uprising, while in Egypt it took 2 years. Hemeti is believed to be the real power in Sudan today. He knows what it takes to crush dissent.
Lindsay Hilsum reporting. Well, with me now is Dame Rosalind Marsden, who spent many years in Sudan, first as the British ambassador and then as the EU special representative. Dame Rosalind, what is clear is that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are pretty keen to keep the army in power, as far as one can see. And the rest of the world doesn't really seem to have done anything at all to support what's happening on the streets.
Well, I think there's been actually quite a strong chorus of international condemnation of what's been happening and calling for the Transitional Military Council to be held accountable. There's been a very significant development today, I think, with this African Union Peace and Security Council decision to suspend Sudan from the African Union until there's a transition to a civilian-led government. And it's not just that suspension. They have also given the regional organisation in cooperation with the African Union the lead in going to Sudan and trying to bring the various stakeholders together. And importantly, they've threatened that if the military council refuses to hand over power to a civilian-led government, then the African Union will automatically impose punitive measures, in other words, sanctions, on those individuals or entities who are obstructing that process.
But the two countries that have most purchase on this revolution, I mean, on the army in terms of trying to stem the revolution, are the UAE and Saudi Arabia, with whom we enjoy very close relationships. What's Britain doing, talking to them at all about behaving better in Sudan?
Well, what's interesting is that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Egypt have, as you say, been the strongest supporters of the military council. But we have seen in the last couple of days both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates showing a certain degree of caution. I think following the terrible massacre in Khartoum on the 3rd of June, when peaceful protesters were attacked and bodies were thrown into the Nile, and there have been terrible reports of rape of doctors and others. I think that they have attempted now to distance themselves somewhat from that and to support the call for negotiations. I don't know whether the United States or the British government have had some influence on them, but at any rate that's a step in the right direction, because I think, as your report indicated, Mr. Hemeti, the head of the Rapid Support Force, is going to be probably the main obstacle to this transition. And those governments are the ones who have most influence over him, because he has been the main provider of Sudanese soldiers in the war in Yemen, and he has been receiving financial and political support from them. So their position is absolutely crucial, as you say.
But with all your experience, relatively briefly, I'm afraid, do you actually have any confidence that this can go a new way? Because poor old Sudan has effectively been in the grip of the military for, well, 40 or 50 years.
Well, indeed. I mean, I think an awful lot's going to hang on whether both the international and the regional community are going to take a really strong and united stand. The pro-democracy protesters have been out on the streets for 6 months. They created in this sit-in area in the centre of Khartoum a sort of area of freedom that represented the new Sudan that many Sudanese have been dreaming of. And of course it's been turned into the scene of a massacre. But I think the pictures from Khartoum have been so extreme that the world has reacted, and whatever Hemeti and his forces did in Darfur, they've now discovered that doing it in Khartoum has evoked a very strong reaction from the rest of the world.
Dame Rosalind, thank you very, very much for talking to us. Thank you.